Hello guys, today we're going to look at the topic on risk management. Now basically, risk management is a very important element for businesses. It will basically help us to be more prepared to address hazards, potential disasters, so that organization will not end up in a firefighting situation. Now we're going to run through what are the key components in a risk management system. Now, of course, there's a lot of framework out there. For example, we have the ERM model, but we do not need to go into a very complex one simply because for the purpose of the exam, this will be adequate. Now, let us just begin with the foundation of looking at what exactly is risk management and how do we start. Now, risk management is basically a process and the systems that involve identification, assessment, evaluation, and controlling of risk according to the risk appetite defined by the organization. So there are four key aspects that we're looking at. Now, first, we're looking at the internal environment, which means you have to set the right culture to support risk management. Now, then we will look into how risk can be identified or determined. And risk assessment is the process of how risks that we've identified are being measured. And then finally, how organizations want to respond to the risk. So how do you tackle them? Now, the first thing that we like to see is about culture and internal environment. Now, basically, this is about how management will set philosophy regarding risk and how they come out with their risk appetite. Now, the internal environment is the one that sets the basis of how risk and control are viewed and addressed by the entity's people. Now, it's actually a very important element because it is the one that determines how the senior management or how the upper management regard risk management as something critical or vital for their organization. So to begin with this, it's actually important for management to embed risk awareness within the culture of the organization. So we will have to see risk management as vital and important. So two things that we need to really know here. One, what is risk awareness? And two, how do you embed it? So basically, we know risk awareness is the knowledge of risk. It's about how we understand the risks of the organization, how we know what are the risk tolerance, our risk limit. We are very clear about our risk appetite. We know exactly why risk occurs, how it occurs, when it occurs, how do you address them, how do you report them. Now, that's what we call risk awareness. Awareness generally refers to knowledge. Now, embedding is about how we build this knowledge within all the people in their organization. So when you have successfully embed risk awareness into the culture of the people, then basically everyone will be capable to address the risk of the organization. So there's a lot of ways of how we can do risk embeddedness. For example, we train them. We show them through policies that risk management is important. Then we can use a lot of success stories, role model. These are all different ways of how risk awareness can be embedded within the culture of the organization. Now, we touch on this thing called risk appetite. Now, what exactly is risk appetite? Now, it talks about two things: the type and the amount of risk that organization is willing to accept or assume within its risk capacity to achieve its objectives. Now, if you talk about the type of risk, now, for example, you may be more inclined to accept credit risk. Now, so that means you are those type that are willing to accept the risk that customers may default. In that case, when you do business, you will offer credit. But if you are not inclined to accept credit risk, then when you do business, you do it on cash basis. Now, that is about type. Now, if like, for example, I am not very inclined to expose myself to forex risk, then I will make sure that whatever transactions that I'm going to enter to it will be in the local or domestic currency. Now, that is the type of risk. So you then have to decide what kind of risk that you're going to accept and what kind of risk that you're basically going to reject. And of course, then the risk that you're going to accept has different degree or level of risk, which is the amount of risk. So you can be generally a risk taker, that you're more happy to accept a higher amount of risk, or you could behave in a risk-averse manner that generally you only accept a smaller amount of risk or lower amount of risk. Now, this actually requires the involvement of CEO, CRO, which is the Chief Risk Officer, together with the approval of the Board of Directors, so that the organizations can come up with the risk appetite framework. So this risk appetite framework basically contains the approach, the policies, the processes, the controls and systems to which risk appetite is being set, communicated and monitored. And then you will have a risk appetite statement. So a risk appetite statement, it's an official document that can be used to communicate to different stakeholders the risk appetite of the organization. So imagine when you don't have your risk appetite defined, you don't have your risk appetite framework, you don't have a risk appetite statement, you may end up with not being well guided. Now, this may result in problems like overexposure of risk, accepting something that you are not ready, or it may also result in missed opportunities. For example, that you know that risk is because of you taking up an opportunity. So because of you rejecting a risk, you will also be missing out the opportunity. But if let's say the risk is clearly within the tolerance of the organization, but because you're not clear about it, you don't want to accept it, you also missed the opportunities. Now, let's just go back to the second part. Okay, what do you mean by risk identification? Now, basically, this is the process of how risks are being determined and how risks are being classified. Now, the risks then have to be documented as well as communicated. So let's first look at how do we do risk identification. So how does organization discover their risk? Well, it could be from past incidents. You know, you suffered an incident like machine breakdown, fire, okay, disasters. You learn from others, the experience that people have been through. You can attend workshops, conference, analysts, experts can share their view to you about some things that might happen in the future. You can do something more formal called risk audit, where you actually engage risk auditor, which can be an internal risk auditor or even an external risk auditor, to come into your organization to conduct a systematic study of your risk. Now, because risk identification has to be a continuous process, what we normally do is we can then use the risk registers. I'm assuming that you already have your risk management system. You have your risk register. So you're going to use the risk registers and run through it, and then you start updating them. So in the process of reviewing and updating the risk register, you then can be able to identify new risk or revise your existing risk. Now, the risk then has to be categorized. So this is basically to lump them in a group, a common group. Now, it will be easier for risk to be understood when we start categorizing them. That means we have them in certain type of risk. Now, at the broad level, right, we can actually divide risk into strategic risk or operational risk. So strategic are generally risk that they are significant in terms of the impact. They are usually very hard for us to predict. Usually is not associated with past event, but it's more towards future actions. It's usually originating from decisions that is from the board of directors and they are managed by the board. It can be so serious that it can even threaten the going concern of the organization, whereas operational risk is right opposite. It could be more towards the day-to-day operations and interruptions of the business, and definitely it's not going to cause a going concern problem. And usually operational risk is much more easier to be managed through our ordinary risk control or internal control system. Now, of course, then we have many categories of risk, and in the exam, examiner may ask you to identify risks or explain them. I'm just putting down some of the common terminologies that we have come across in our study. We have financial risk, we have market risk, and market risk can then be divided into different types of market. Forex is a market, your foreign exchange risk, interest rate risk, equity price risk, commodity price risk, like petrol price going down, that's commodity. Palm oil, sugar, soil, this kind of thing. Now, credit risk, liquidity risk, health and safety, environmental, reputation, technology, and so on. Now, you got to understand the meaning of all these risks, which they are not in itself difficult. It's kind of like easy for us to deduce or guess what that risk is. Like if you say health and safety, we know this is the risk that concerns the potential physical hazards to the people. All right, now so you are expecting all that in the exam. Okay, now, and the risk that you've actually identified will have to be recorded in a risk register. That's a formal record of the risk, and many informations are being recorded here, like who are the risk author, the people who detected the risk, who is the risk owner, the person in charge of this risk, when was the risk last updated, because that may shows whether your risk register is still relevant or not. What is the impact and the probability of the risk? What are the risk controls that we have for this risk so that we can manage them? What are the consequences that when the risk ever materialize? What is the risk status? So if we decided to implement certain risk control, how successful are you in implementing it? Is it still ongoing, or is it done? Is it completed? Now, what is a risk correlation? Because we know that two risks can be positively or negatively correlated to each other. Now, for example, if you look at environmental risk, reputation risk. Now, if you have very high environmental risk, you can have very high reputation risk as well. Because when environmental risk goes up, it shows that if your business activity is going to cause a lot of damage to the environmental risk goes up. And when that happens, your business reputation will be adversely affected. So your reputation risk goes up as well. So these two risks are positively correlated. And the reputation risk depends on your environmental risk. And also what type of risk that you're referring to. So that's basically the categorizations that we say just now, and also the degree of your risk tolerance. Are you going to accept the risk, reject the risk, and so on? Okay, now this is the big things that we have in terms of identifying our risk, and let's move on to assessing risk. This is the process of how we evaluate risk, how we quantify risk into impact and probability. And basically, impact and probability, what does it mean? Probability is the chance that risk materializing. Impact is the potential consequence. And normally, impact is being quantified financially. The example, you can say that if there is a fire occurring in the organization, the loss that we're going to suffer is $5 million. Now, that's quantifying them financially. So how do we actually assess risk? Now, there are two things that you have to take note. One, if the environment is dynamic or static, which basically environment that's dynamic means it changes very, very fast. Static environment is an environment that is very stable and it does not change much. And the moment when dynamic environment is present, because of the rapid change to the environment, a lot of things will be very different. For example, the risk impact or the risk probability can be very different. Today, you may have very high impact. Tomorrow, the impact may go down. And because risks are so dynamic, it has to be regularly assessed. Because if you don't regularly assess them, your risk management could be out of date. And then you may end up doing the wrong thing to address the risk. The second thing is whether this is an objective or subjective assessment. The risk that can be objectively assessed refers to risks that you can quantify them with scientific accuracy. Now, it's more towards things that you have data, historical data, you have technologies that you can use to determine that how much risk that this is going to be. Like, how certain are you that the probability is going to be of certain percentage and how much impact that is going to be. Now, that is objective subjective assessment. Now, we recognize the fact that usually impact can be more objectively assessed, while most of the time the probability is subjective. Now, so when you do risk assessment, at the end of the risk assessment, what you're going to do with all the risks that you've assessed, now you normally will present them in a risk map. Now, the examiner called this a heat map. So what you're seeing now in front of you is a heat map, that basically we have a map that we actually put it against the probability and the impact, and then you see that all the numbers are being positioned in the risk map, and each of the number actually refers to a kind of risk that we have. And what is the use of a risk map? We're going to see later on that how risk map can be helpful in designing our risk response, which is the last component of our risk management. Now, there are 4 ways or 4 strategy. Okay, so they can call this as a risk management strategy. First is transfer of risk. Basically, transfer is to share out the impact, like buying insurance. Risk acceptance. Accepting a risk means you're not going to do anything so that you're ready to absorb the impact the moment when the risk materializes. Reduction is basically a minimization of the risk probability. For example, internal controls. And then avoidance is basically to avoid decisions or actions that will give rise to the risk. Now, this is what we often call it as TARA framework. So imagine that we have to put up a risk or heat map that we've just said just now against probability and impact, and we can measure them now, of course, in a more straightforward way, whether they are high or low impact or probability. So the more serious kind of risk is obviously risk that the probability is high and the impact is high, and for that kind of risk, the logical things to do is to avoid it. Whereas the most insignificant risk is those that they have low probability and low impact, and in this case, we don't mind accept the risk. Now, what do you do when the risk probability is high? Now, since the probability is high, then it's wise for us to do something that can reduce the probability. So the correct strategy is to engage risk reduction. Now, whereas if you have those risks that the impact is high, then what we should do is to transfer the risk so that the impact can be further minimized or further reduced. Okay, now that are the 4 risk management strategy that is often designed in response to the degree of risk probability and impact that we've assessed. Right, that's a very quick way of looking at risk management system and some of the key components within it. Thank you very much, guys, and hope that this will help you to revise your knowledge on risk management.